Ted Bundy. Just saying the name kind of sends a shiver down your spine, right? I mean, even after all these years, he represents a very specific kind of horror. It's like the evil that hides behind a friendly face. And in this deep dive, we're going to strip away the sensationalism that's built up around him and really try to get to the core of who he was and how he managed to do what he did.
You hit the nail on the head. Bundy is, to this day, a deeply disturbing figure. And we're not interested in adding to the hype or anything. We want to understand him. To lay out the fundamental aspects of his identity, how he operated, we've dug into a ton of documented accounts, and we're going to bring you, I guess you could say, a synthesized understanding. We'll tackle some of the big questions that always come up.
Exactly. We're aiming to really unpack who Ted Bundy was and get a clear picture of his modus operandi, his MO. So I guess a place to start is, who was Ted Bundy?
Well, he was born Theodore Robert Cowell, but later, of course, became known as Theodore Robert Bundy. That was in November of '46. He admitted to committing over 30 murders, and these were spread across several states during the 1970s. But it's widely believed that the true number of his victims is actually much, much higher. Some estimates put it somewhere between 50 and over 100. In the end, he was executed in Florida in January of '89.
And something that consistently stands out is his charm and intelligence. It's almost creepy how effectively he used those qualities.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just surface level charm either. Witnesses often described him as having this disarming sincerity, as if he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like he truly understood you. It was this carefully crafted persona that was his main weapon in gaining the trust of his victims. And remember, he maintained his innocence for over a decade, which, really underscores the deceptive nature of the guy. Interestingly, he was married to Carol Ann Boone back in 1980. They had a child together and then later divorced in '86.
It's really hard to reconcile that with the horrific nature of his crimes. And it's even more unsettling to think that in '71, he actually worked at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center alongside Ann Rule, who later wrote his biography. It's a disturbing juxtaposition.
It is. He was also briefly engaged to Elizabeth Klepfer, who you often see referred to under different pseudonyms in the literature about him. Now, Bundy, he held a BA from the University of Washington. He even went to law school at the University of Utah. He also held what seemed like pretty normal jobs, like assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, and he even worked at the Department of Emergency Services. These details really paint a picture of someone who appeared to be functioning within society, which makes his true nature all the more shocking,
Right, he wasn't some isolated figure. He was integrated into the community. Then there's the other side of the story. He was arrested in Utah in '75. This was for the aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault of Carol Daronch. And of course, there were those infamous escapes from custody in Colorado back in '77.
Those escapes definitely fueled his notoriety and really ramped up the public sphere. He was eventually recaptured in Florida in '78. And then, of course, he was convicted for those brutal Chi Omega sorority house murders and the murder of Kimberly Leach. They gave him 3 death sentences for those crimes.
People who observed him up close, they definitely had strong reactions. Ann Rule famously labeled him a sadistic sociopath.
Right. And even Bundy himself actually gave this chillingly accurate self-assessment. I mean, he described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Even his own defense attorney, Polly Nelson, agreed with that. She called him the very definition of heartless evil. These stark descriptions from all these different perspectives, they really highlight the deeply disturbing nature of his personality.
Okay, so we've got a sense of who Ted Bundy was on the surface and some pretty chilling insights into his true nature. Let's dig into the specifics of how he operated. Like, what was his modus operandi?
Well, the evidence really points to the fact that Bundy's MO wasn't a fixed thing. It changed over time. It adapted to different locations. Like in those early stages, primarily in Washington and Oregon, his tactics usually involved forced entry into the homes of his victims, often late at night. And he would brutally attack these women who were often sleeping with blunt objects. The case of Karen Sparks is a horrific example of this early pattern.
And then there's that really disturbing tactic, the one with his Volkswagen Beetle, right?
Exactly. He would often pretend to need help with his car, his tan Volkswagen Beetle. He'd often fake an injury. Maybe he'd wear a cast or a sling, sometimes use crutches. He did this to lure women to him. Linda Ann Healy, Janice Ann Ott, and Denise Marie Naslund. They're just a few of the victims linked to this incredibly manipulative approach. It really played on that basic human instinct to help someone in need.
It's terrifying how he twisted that inherent human kindness. So did his methods change when he moved to Utah?
In Utah, things got, I guess you could say, more organized, maybe even more confident. He continued with that whole simulated injury thing to get victims to his car, but then he started taking them back to his apartment. This suggests a growing desire for control, a need for a more prolonged interaction with his victims. His apartment essentially became a secondary crime scene where sexual assault and murder took place. You see this in the cases of Melissa Ann Smith and Laura Ann Aim. He also began impersonating authority figures, like Officer Roseland, for example, as a way to gain trust. Carol Durant experienced this firsthand.
That's a really disturbing layer. To impersonate authority, to prey on the trust people have in those figures. What about his time in Florida? Did his MO change again?
Well, in Florida, it seems like there was almost a regression. He went back to more indiscriminate attacks. The most horrifying example of this is the break-in at the Chi Omega sorority house. He just brutally attacked those women while they were sleeping. But he was still using ruses. Like, he pretended to be Richard Burton, fire department, in the Leslie Parmenter incident. That particular attempt didn't work, though.
So it was this disturbing combination of calculated deception and just pure brutal violence. And he would adapt his tactics as needed. Were there any tactics that stayed consistent throughout his crimes?
Actually, yeah, a few core tactics remained consistent. He was really meticulous about minimizing physical evidence. It's incredible, but they never found fingerprints at any of his crime scenes. He also consistently avoided using firearms. He preferred blunt trauma and strangulation. Transporting his victims to other, more secluded locations, that was another common element. It gave him more time and control. He also often used handcuffs to restrain his victims. And this is disturbing, but in several cases, he actually went back to the bodies. He groomed them and performed sexual acts indicating necrophilia. And then there's the decapitation. He decapitated at least 12 victims, and some reports say he kept some of the heads as, well, mementos. That reveals a truly depraved and chilling aspect of his crimes.
It's a disturbingly detailed picture of a methodical and brutal killer. Let's shift gears a little and look at some of the most frequently asked questions that come up when we talk about Ted Bundy.
One of the most basic questions is when and where his documented murder spree took place. We've touched on it, but to be clear, it started in '74 in Washington, Oregon. It then spread south and east to Idaho, Utah, and Colorado before continuing in Florida in '78. That wide geographic spread is a big part of why he was able to evade capture for so long. I mean, law enforcement in different states, initially, they had no reason to think these crimes were connected.
What were the other key factors that allowed him to evade capture for such a long time? I mean, the number of victims was growing.
Right. There were a number of interconnected factors that helped him stay under the radar. We talked about the wide geographic spread. And then there was the lack of physical evidence at the crime scenes. This was a major roadblock for investigators. His use of deception, the whole thing with the fake injuries and impersonating authority figures, it allowed him to gain trust and avoid suspicion. And then there's the fact that he had a pretty ordinary and changeable appearance. It made it really hard for witnesses to identify him. Early on, there was also a certain amount of disbelief, even when there were tips coming in, that someone like Bundy, a seemingly clean-cut law student, could actually be capable of such horrific acts. Initially, there also wasn't a clear pattern or common thread among the victims besides their general demographics, and that really hampered those early investigations. Sadly, there was also a reluctance among law enforcement agencies in different areas to share information effectively. And finally, there's his personality. He was organized, calculating, and he had a disturbing knowledge of how law enforcement works, probably from his time working in crime prevention and emergency services. All of that gave him a significant advantage.
It's a sobering reminder of just how challenging criminal investigations can be, especially when you're dealing with such deliberate deception. Another question that comes up a lot is about his psychological state. What did those assessments reveal about his pathology?
Well, there were some differences in the psychiatric evaluations, but most of the evidence pointed towards antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. It's characterized by, that superficial charm and charisma that masks a really profound lack of empathy. There's an absence of guilt or remorse and a tendency towards manipulative behavior. Some experts also thought he might have had narcissistic personality disorder, even malignant narcissism. It's crucial to understand that while he knew intellectually the difference between right and wrong, it didn't really affect his behavior. He didn't have that internal moral compass that guides most people.
It's a truly chilling disconnect. And finally, the big question that everyone wants to know. How many victims did he actually confess to, and what's the estimated total?
Before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 murders. But the estimated total number of his victims is still unknown, and it's believed to be much higher. He hinted at a larger number himself, but never gave a concrete figure. Investigators, looking at the circumstantial evidence and patterns, think it could be somewhere between 50 and 75, or maybe even more than 100. It's unsettling to think about. It really emphasizes the horrific scale of his crimes and the lasting impact on all those communities he terrorized.
And what about those last few days before his execution? Anything notable about his behavior or his confessions?
Well, when he was facing execution, Bundy did a lot of interviews. He would often talk about his crimes in the third person, which is pretty strange. It seems like he was trying to distance himself emotionally from the brutality. He would give these really disturbing details about the crimes, his motivations, even his post-mortem behaviors, including the necrophilia and the fact that he kept some of the victims' heads as mementos. He also tried to bargain with investigators, offering information about murders he hadn't confessed to in exchange for delaying his execution. Didn't work, though. His confessions, they reveal this really disturbing sense of possession and a chilling satisfaction he got from those brutal acts. It provides a glimpse into a truly twisted psyche.
It's a dark and disturbing end to our deep dive into who Ted Bundy was and how he operated. So, to recap, we've seen a man who is a master at creating this facade of charm and intelligence. And he used that to lure and brutally murder countless victims across several states. His modus operandi evolved over time, adapting to his circumstances, but it was always characterized by this desire to minimize evidence and to have complete control over his victims.
Exactly. Bundy's case continues to be a subject of intense scrutiny and study, and for good reason. It forces us to face some uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the difficulties of criminal investigations, and how deceiving outward appearances can be.
It really makes you think. Reflecting on everything that allowed Ted Bundy to evade capture for as long as he did, what does it tell us about the challenges we still face today when it comes to identifying and catching individuals who are capable of such horrific crimes? And that's even with all the advancements we've made in forensic science and criminal profiling. It's a question that continues to haunt us.
It does. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a truly disturbing chapter of criminal history.
And if you found this exploration insightful, and if you want to delve deeper into other complex and intriguing topics, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive. We're looking forward to exploring new subjects with you next time.